You would think that a Pokemon that is as widely eaten as these Pokemon are would be easier to find information on how to care for them. After all, if you're being farmed, then you have to know how to keep them alive, right? Well, you, like me, would be very incorrect in that assumption. Every time I tried to look up information on these Pokemon, all I found was info on how to care for the meat, how to prep it for cooking, and the best dishes to make with it. Which is good for my personal life, don't get me wrong, I love me some seafood, but that doesn't help when I'm trying to give people advice on how to keep their pets at home. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the crustacean Pokemon Krabby and its evolution in Kingler. Krabby is a 1 foot tall, 14 pound, crab. That's 0.4 meters and 6.5 kilos. We all know what a crab looks like, right? Multiple sets of legs, 2 pincher claws, a central round body covered in chitinous armor. It's the perfect form, at least according to the carcinization theory. Krabby itself is red on its upper body and claws, with the rest of its body being an off-white or tan color. It has 2 eyes above a rather wide mouth, and 2 spikes that stick up over its eyes. Upon evolving, Kingler is much bigger, standing just over 4 feet tall, 1.4 meters, and weighing 132 pounds on average, which is 60 kilos. It has the same general body plan as Krabby, except that now one claw has grown much bigger in size, being used for hunting and for defense. As well, the Pokemon's body has become more spiked, with the lower lip of its jaw now being very jagged and savage looking, and a crown of spikes growing along the top of its head. But these Pokemon don't really change that much with evolution. I'm sure many of you are way more familiar with these Pokemon as meals on your plates, but for now, let's get into it and find out if these Pokemon could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Despite the fact that these guys are water types, and they're consistently associated with the ocean and large bodies of water, they don't actually spend a lot of their time in the water. Instead, they spend a lot of their time on the sandy beaches surrounding the water. They use the sand to dig up their burrows and protect themselves from predators and to ambush their own prey. And so, you'll need to replicate that environment for them. The first part is, of course, going to be the water. The nice part about these Pokemon is that saltwater or freshwater doesn't matter to them. They can withstand a very high degree of salinity or live along the shores of any freshwater lake. So when you dig the pond or pool for these guys, you can fill it with really any water you have on hand. The only thing I have to warn you about is that if you use tap water or municipal water to fill the pond, which I'm sure you would as you have ready access to it, then you'll need to add in some Pokemon-safe cleaning chemicals. Tap water often has added things in it, like fluoride or small amounts of chemicals to keep it clean. But for Pokemon like the Krabby line, who filter the air out of the water with gills, those elements and heavy metals can get caught in their gills and end up causing problems for the Pokemon's breathing. Thankfully, there are certain chemicals that you can add to the water that will bind all of that stuff together and cause it to sink to the bottom of the pond. Once that happens, you can just go in and pull it out. As for the size you want, it'll differ based on a few different factors. You see, despite how much time they spend on land, these Pokemon still have gills underneath their shells, which obviously means they need water to breathe. But thanks to that hard shell and the way their gills work, as long as their gills are damp, if not wet, then they're able to breathe out of the water. So the water needs to be large enough and deep enough for your Pokemon to fully submerge itself and re-wet its gills. But you also need to think about the weather. Krabby and Kingler don't like the things that come with harsh winters, like snow and ice. So in places where winter has a pretty profound effect, they head into deeper waters. There, they bury themselves in sand and dirt, entering into an almost dormant state until the temperature increases. This way, they can avoid any winter weather that comes about, and if you live in a place where winter does come about, you'll have to make sure that the pond is deep enough for them to avoid the cold. That, or you can keep the water heated through the winter, though that can end up getting expensive for your electric bill. With those two things in mind, let's get into the actual construction of the pond for these Pokemon. To start, the surrounding area of the pond and the entire bottom of the pond needs to be coated in sand. That way they can dig and bury themselves. Obviously, you'll need to make the sand thicker for Kingler than for Krabby, but so long as it's deep enough that the Pokemon can adequately hide, then you should be fine. Getting back to the bottom of the pond, you have to make sure that at least one side of the pond has a nice, low gradient downward. This is so that the Pokemon is able to walk into the deepest layers. While crustaceans like the Krabby line can swim, they more often prefer to walk along the bottom of the water, and are not well known for jumping into deeper water. If you just make the edge of their pond a sharp drop like the edge of an in-ground pool, then they won't feel comfortable getting in that way. You have to make it a gentle slope that leads down into the deeper parts of the water. Also, as with any other water habitat, you'll have to add in a filtration system to keep the water clean and a way to keep the water oxygenated, like a fountain or something that'll cause waves to form on the water's surface. You could also decorate the bottom of the pond a bit. Nothing major, but a few rocks, some shells, maybe a few plants that could help oxygenate the water. Just keep in mind that you'll also have to care for those plants as well, which is another thing to keep track of. And finally, the actual dimensions of the pond. For a Krabby, the pond should be between 10 to 15 feet across, 3 to 4.5 meters, and 3 feet deep, 1 meter, if you don't have to deal with any kind of harsh winter environments. But if you do have to deal with a harsh winter, then you'll need to make the pond at least 8 feet deep to compensate for it, which is 2.5 meters. For a Kingler, you'll need to make the pond a lot bigger, needing to be at least 20 feet across and 10 feet deep with a mild or no winter, and 15 feet deep with harsher winters. That's 7 meters, 3 meters, and 4.5 meters respectively. In all, it's a very big section of water, and you're gonna need to get your hands on some major form of construction equipment to be able to do it yourself. Lastly is the Pokemon that you can house with these guys. Honestly, I wouldn't really recommend it, even with other Pokemon of the same species. Krabby and Kingler are very solitary in nature, only really getting together to breed. Other than those times, they can be very territorial, fighting over any stretch of sand that they consider theirs. As well, Krabby can be a very common prey Pokemon for anything that has the power to take them down, as they don't really have the size or strength to fight off anything too big. It's the same with trying to put any other Pokemon in the water with them. They feed on fish and other sea Pokemon, especially the Shelter line. So putting them in with your Krabby evolution is just asking for Pokemon to go missing. Unless you plan on expanding the enclosure to accommodate the needs of the other Pokemon you put in there, and to help them stay away from your Krabby, I'd recommend that you keep these Pokemon on their own. Availability. These Pokemon are most common in the Kanto region, hence why they're counted in the Kanto Pokedex. Well, they're also really common in the Johto region too, but the Pokedex was first implemented in Kanto, so they got first dibs. Anyway, you can find a Krabby evolution on pretty much any route in the southeast of Kanto that has water in it. Same with any city in that area. I mean, if you're south of Cerulean City and east of the Seafoam Islands, you have a decent chance of catching a Krabby evolution. Same with Johto. If you're near the ocean in Johto, then you have a decent chance of finding a Krabby. Oddly enough though, there are reports of them in the Burn Tower in Ecruteak City as well, which, for those of you who know the area, will understand that's weird because there's no large body of water near there. So I have no idea what they're doing there. But these Pokemon are well known to be able to survive in harsh environments, so maybe they don't mind it that much. Aside from the Kanto and Johto regions, Krabby and Kingler actually aren't that common. They appear in small areas here and there, like the waters of the Verbank complex in Unova, sometimes Route 226 in Sinnoh, though that's unreliable, and a few spots in the Galarian wild areas, like Lake Axelwell and Lake Mylock. Hoenn has been known to have a few reports of them from routes 105 and 109, you know, the stretch of ocean between Sleetport City and Petalburg. They're not common, though, which is weird considering how much water that region has in it. In fact, the regions that have the most water are the ones that don't have any kind of population of these guys. Paldean, Colossian, and Alolan waters and beaches are all free of this Pokemon, which is strange. Those should be the perfect habitats for them, but who knows what's going on there. Maybe they got outcompeted by another water type? As for the breeding industry, it's the same thing as Shelter. There are a ton of breeding farms for these guys, but they're all food farms. These Pokemon are a very popular seafood dish, so it won't be too hard to find a place that's raising them. The biggest issue I can see coming from that is that those big feeder farms like that often have exclusivity deals with big restaurant or grocery chains. And even if they don't, their whole business model relies on selling a lot of Pokemon meat in bulk. They might not even give you the time of day with you just trying to buy one or two of them. Honestly, your best bet might be trying to catch one of them. Thanks to their enclosure needs, not many people actually raise and breed these Pokemon outside the food farms. I'm sure you could find one, but in the time it takes you to find one and get into contact with them, you would have most likely been able to go and get one from the wild. Or, if you don't live in a region that has a wild population, or at least not nearby, then you could get one from another private seller, like trading with someone from a Krabby dense region, or hiring a trainer to go out and catch one for you, but that can get way more expensive very quickly. Catchability. Catching these guys can be very time-consuming to do. They spend their time either on the beaches surrounding water or in the water itself. If you're looking to get one from the water, you'll need a decent fishing rod or one of the really high-end ones if you're aiming for a Kingler. As for bait, really any kind of meat would work for these Pokemon, as they're not that picky when it comes to what they eat. And after that, it's just your basic fishing. Remember to be careful when doing this, as you aren't guaranteed to bring up the Pokemon you're looking for, and could just as easily bring up a Pokemon that is much more dangerous. When out fishing for these Pokemon, be sure to bring an electric or a grass type with you, as that'll give you the best level of protection possible. Honestly though, your best bet is finding one on land. It'll make catching it a lot easier and take the randomness of fishing out of the equation. When hunting for a Krabby evolution on the beach, be sure to check any nearby rock piles and formations, as Krabby likes to hide out in them for its burrows. A Kingler is oftentimes a bit too big to hide among rocks, so those will be at least easier for you to spot as they move and settle along the beach. Either way, when you eventually try to catch the Pokemon, a Pokeball or Great Ball is around the strength you'll need for a Krabby, and a Great Ball to an Ultra Ball is what you'll need for Kingler. Care. Just like the other aquatic enclosures we've done, cleaning is going to be a big part of the care for these Pokemon. But before we dig into that, let's cover a few smaller things first. Food-wise, these Pokemon are carnivores, often hunting other aquatic Pokemon, a favorite of theirs being the Shelter line. In fact, I think the Kingler with its massive claw is one of the few Pokemon that actively prey on Cloyster. Combined with that hunting, they also scavenge, taking any meat that they can find. So, thankfully, you don't have to feed them live prey for them to eat, which is good because that can be a major roadblock to a lot of people. Instead, you'll just be taking chunks of meat and feeding those directly to your Pokemon. When doing so, your best bet is to always place the food in the same space inside the enclosure. That way the Pokemon can get used to always expecting the food to be provided at that spot. This provides a few nice bonuses for you, like having your Pokemon associate you with the positive feeling of being fed, and it helps you to be somewhat in control of the mess from feeding. Your Pokemon is still a Pokemon, and it's still an aquatic creature. it may decide that for one meal it wants to pull the food down into the water, and in that case, you're going to have to clean the water. But, like I said, if you keep feeding them at the same spot over and over, then it should help to lower the times that you have to do that. Lastly, when it comes to winter with these Pokemon, like I said, they tend to go to the bottom of the water and go dormant until the water warms up again. If you do this, then you won't have to feed them for the winter. If you keep throwing food into the water, then it'll just make the water gross and do nothing for your Pokemon. It'll make a bunch more work for you and just waste food. When you feed your Pokemon, you want to give them, obviously, meat. And more specifically, fish. The easiest and cheapest meat for you to get would most likely be Magikarp fillets. You don't have to do much to prepare it at all, you just wash it beforehand to remove anything from the packing plant, and I would cut it into smaller chunks. You could just feed them the entire fillet, but that's going to lead to them just ripping and biting chunks off of the food, and again, that's going to make a much bigger mess than if you had just given them bite-sized bits. Also, trying to limit the mess the food will make, you should serve it to them in a dish, trying to keep it out of the sand. Not that the sand will do anything to your Pokemon if they ingest it, but if you keep it out of the sand, it'll mean that you don't have to constantly clean up the fish bits and juices from the ground. Finally, for the amount of food. Krabby, with how small it is, will only get about a half pound of food a day, being fed in one big meal. Kingler, though, with how big it ends up being, will need about 4 pounds of food a day, which is a lot of fish over the course of a month. But, like I've always said, fully evolved Pokemon will always take a lot of resources to keep. Oh, and you'll have to add in a calcium supplement for the food as well. In the wild, they tend to eat the bones and organs of their prey as well, and that gives them a modest amount of supplements for the upkeep of their shell. Since we're only going to be feeding them the fillets and not the bones and organs of the fish, they will need the correct minerals for their shells, or it'll end up becoming fragile and eventually breaking and not growing correctly. So a calcium supplement could help keep your Pokemon shell from becoming too weak and, in turn, causing damage. Which nicely leads us away from the food and into the next thing you need to know: molting. A shell is not as flexible and stretchy as skin, obviously. So for Pokemon that have a hard outer shell like arachnids, arthropods, and crustaceans, when they either grow in size or their outer shell is damaged, they need to molt away their outer shell to make room for the newer shell. This isn't really a thing that you need to deal with so much as it's something that you need to keep an eye on. Much like how reptiles can sometimes have shed skin that gets stuck, sometimes a molting part of the shell can get stuck to your Pokemon. If you notice that your Pokemon has shed the majority of its shell, but there's just 1 or 2 plates that aren't coming away, then you're going to have to take them to the Pokemon Center to get it removed. Trying to do it yourself could easily lead to hurting your Pokemon. Also, if your Pokemon is just freshly molted, leave them be for a bit. After a molt, your Pokemon's shell will be very soft and they'll feel very vulnerable. At this point, you being around could cause them undue stress, and with the softened shell, you could very easily accidentally hurt them. Better to leave them alone and wait for that shell to harden up once again. As for how often this happens, Krabby will end up doing this a lot more often than Kingler, about 3 to 4 times a month. And Kingler will do this once every 30 to 50 days, so possibly not even once a month. The trend is the older the Pokemon, the less often they molt their shell. However, this isn't so much a thing that you have to clean up, as it's something to just keep an eye out for. When a crustacean Pokemon like this sheds its shell, they need to build up calcium in their bodies again to harden up and strengthen the new shell. And, well, the old shell that they just molted off is very high in calcium, so yeah. Oftentimes, they'll just eat their old molted shell. Kinda gross, I know, but hey, you can never say that nature isn't good at recycling. So, if you notice that the old molted shell is just sitting in the enclosure, leave it there for about a week. Your Pokemon might just clean it up on their own without you having to do anything. If, after a week, some or all of the old shell is still there, then you can get rid of it, because any longer than that will begin to rot and cause problems. Which brings us back full circle to cleaning. As with any living being, these Pokemon will produce waste. Combined with any food bits that are left behind after a meal, molted shell, and the risk of things like algae, moss, and salt deposits building up, you want to make sure that you keep their enclosures fairly clean. For the sandy beach part of the enclosure, that's easy. You just have to scoop up any waste or leftover food. This will lead to you scooping up some sand when you do this, it's just unavoidable, so you will have to add in new sand every now and then. But unless you're taking big fistfuls of sand when you're scooping, then it won't be that common of a thing that you have to do. The water, though, that is another matter. No matter what you do, no matter all the ways in this guide that I've detailed just how to try to keep the water clean, even with a filtration system running day and night, eventually the water is going to get gross. Either through the Pokemon's waste, or food bits, or just time. The water will get to a point where you'll need to change it out. Now, you could do this all at once, but it's actually better to do it a little bit at a time over the course of a month or so, for multiple reasons. One of those is the possibility of water shock to your Pokemon. See, if you just take all the water out and replace it with new water, you run the risk of the water being different enough to cause a shock to your Pokemon's system. Granted, this is much more of a concern if you're doing a saltwater pond, as salinity is a major factor in that, but you also want to keep an eye on the mineral levels of your freshwater too. This is why changing only a little bit at a time is a better idea, because even if something in the new water is different than the water already in the pond, it'll get mixed in and allow your Pokemon to adjust to slightly changed levels. And another reason is that it's just easier on you as the trainer. It takes less time, there's less water to move around, and it's easier on your water bill if you have one. The best method that I've seen is that when you start to notice that the water is turning gross, drain and replace 20% of the pool's volume every 3 days. This will ensure that the water slowly gets turned from gross to clean once again. The only downside to this is that, since you're mixing the clean water into the old water, you may have to do it more than 5 times, changing out more than 100% of the volume of the pool. But if this method doesn't seem like the best way, you can always do the entire thing all at once. Just be sure that the water won't cause a shock to your Pokemon's system. Oh, and also don't forget to check and clean the filter. It's going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting of keeping the water clean, so you'll have to change it out or clean it pretty regularly. I'm sure you've noticed that the majority of this care section has been about the enclosure and food, with very little on interacting with the Pokemon themselves. And that's because there isn't really going to be much interaction with them. Like I said before, crabs are very solitary creatures. They don't really care about being around others. And especially being around larger creatures like humans, it can make them nervous as they aren't exactly the top of their food chain in the wild. That's not to say you won't be able to be friendly with them. As you spend more and more time caring for them and bringing them food, they will begin to acclimatize to you and possibly even approach you when you get near their enclosure, looking for food or snacks. It's just that they'll never be a cuddly, friendly sort of Pokemon. The best you can get to is for them to tolerate you being in their space and near them for periods of time. And it may take some time for you to even reach that point. So don't go getting one of these Pokemon expecting to have a crab cuddle buddy. Word of advice though, watch out for the pinchers. If they're strong enough to crack Shelter and Enclosure shells, I don't want to think about what they'll do to a human hand. Cost. The enclosure actually isn't going to be that bad this time. Renting the equipment to dig the pond won't be too bad. As well, getting the couple tons of sand that you'll need for the enclosure shouldn't be too much either. Though the sheer size of a Kingler's enclosure is going to bring the price up significantly. Lastly, if we include the price of the water to fill it up, then a Krabby enclosure will probably put you in the upper end of the moderate category, and Kingler will probably be in the middle of the high category. Food is going to be nearly as expensive as the Enclosure was to set up. Because they're eating seafood, it's going to be more expensive than almost any other kind of food you could buy. And with how much they eat of it, you're likely in the high category per month for Krabby, and very high category per month for Kingler. At least if you have a notable winter in your region, the Pokemon will go dormant for a couple months, and you'll be able to save a bit of money there. The Pokemon is probably going to be your cheapest option overall. Mostly because you're more likely to catch them yourself than to get them from a breeder. That will leave you in the low category, and most of that is going to be you buying the fishing rod. If you do end up getting the Pokemon from someone else, like trading it or hiring a trainer, then you're probably looking at the moderate category for a Krabby and the high category for a Kingler. Conclusion. When it comes to water-type Pokemon, these guys honestly aren't that bad. The cleaning isn't too bad for their Enclosure, and there aren't any complex things that you have to take care of, like with the circulation for the Tentacool line, or the threat of evolution with a Magikarp. Sure, they aren't the most sociable Pokemon, but if you're looking for a sturdy, reliable Pokemon, then these guys are a great choice, and could even end up becoming the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the electrical, exploding ball Pokemon, Voltorb, and Electrode. Have a wonderful night, everyone.